And welcome back to the Woodgrafter. Two-part mini-series looking at how we're going to build this industrial inspired console table. That sounds good? Stick around. So like all projects, we're going to start off with some raw stock. So let's see what we've got on the bench for this project. The top and the low shelf are going to be made out of a laminated oak, and I've got three lengths here of rough cut oak, and these are normally 160, 170 in width. The length of these nominally about 2.4 meters, and the thickness somewhere around about, what's that, 25 millimeters. Oh, now unusually for me, I'm also combining the oak tops with that rather elegant black frame that you saw on the finished product, and this is what I am using. Now this is actually industrial handrail. If you've ever been to any industrial environment, you'll see the handrails made of the yellow, powder coated in yellow, and I've had it powder coated in black, and I've got a number of lengths here, and we'll look at that further down the line. And then I've got the fittings to go with it, again in powder black, and it sort of kind of gives me that look that I'm going for in this particular project, which is industrial in nature, but I just think that the powder coat black just enhances it a little bit and just makes it less industrial and therefore more suitable for a domestic environment. And I quite like this sort of bulky contrast with the polished oak once that's finished. So I'm going to clear the bench down and we're going to make a start. First thing I want to do is to take the oak and I want to mill that down into something we can actually use. Now I'm just looking at the design of the top, and the top's going to be laminated, and we'll talk about that and the reasons why shortly. But I seem to come up with an overall length of 1,197 millimeters. God knows what I was doing in the design phase there, but I'll correct that. But the length of our overall bench will be half of the usable stock. Now we know that this is a nominal 2,400 millimeters long, so we'll do it somewhere around about 1,200. So I'm going to cut all of these in half first of all, and that's just to make them more manageable as I lug them around the various tools. Let's get that done. To give me the room to move on these, because obviously this is rough stock, I'm going to find the center of this as is, and then we'll cut it in half, and then we'll do the same with the other two as well. So overall I've got 2,442. So we'll make a cut at 1,221. Okay, and just by chopping those up into those usable lengths, it makes it easier, because the next job is I want to mill these down. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to take this over to the planer jointer and I'm going to mill it down. Now what I'm looking for is a flat edge here that I can work with as a reference when I come to slice this up. We'll talk about that in the lamination shortly. I want to take out these bows in the wood by giving myself a nice flat surface, and then I'll work on this side and I'll bring it down to round about 20 millimeters, and that's the width of the laminations that we're going to have, and again we'll talk about that later. Let's go to planer jointer and get these ready to do some work on. So about an hour later and a little bit of milling and effort, we have the stock ready. Really quite pleased with this because I've never used this supply before, so to see the grade pattern coming out on these is quite nice. For those who've got really good observation skills, you'll know there's 5 here, and I actually cut 6. Now one of them would have required too much milling. I managed to get these down to 22 millimeters. I was aiming for 20, so I managed to get more stock than I expected at 22 millimeters, but one would have taken me down to 19 mil. And because I want all the laminations in the wood to be the same size, all of these come down to 19 mil as well. So I've scrapped one and we'll see how we get on. So the next job is I want to cut these down into laminations. Now the reason I want to do that, if you can look at the end grain here, you can see that the end grain's going in this direction. These are what's known as plain sawn, so these just take slices through the tree as they're milled, which is pretty normal and how most of your stock's going to arrive. The problem with that is these will expand and contract quite a lot in this direction as the moisture content changes. Now because of the rings, that means these will also bow in this direction. So if I just come along and just laminate these together to give me the width of the overall top, as are, I will start to get some bows and ebbs in that top. And that's not what I want. Although it's an urban design, it's based on those sort of scaffold boards that twist and warp. I don't want that to twist and warp. It'll take the frame out of skew and it won't look good in 5, 10, 15, 20 years. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to take laminations through this stock now. So I'm going to rip this down to a size and then I'll turn them over and laminate them. So I'll end up with this end grain here, this edge grain on top of the table, and that will give me a lot of stability in the top. And even as moisture contents change, this will not bow and cup in the same way. Wood always moves, but you can constrain and contain it by this technique. Now the downside is that you lose some of these gorgeous cathedrals and laminations that you have in the woods. So you are sacrificing to some extent there. Now we could rip these in a variety of ways. We could use the track saws that we have on the wall here. I could use my bandsaw, I could use my table saw. The easiest way and the most accurate way is actually via a table saw, although the bandsaw is a good option as well. Track saws will do the job for you, nice neat cut, but because it's a very, very narrow cut, it can be quite fiddly with a track saw, so we're going to go and use the table saw. So I'll set that up and we'll have a look at the next step. So I've set my table saw up for a rip of 32mm, and now it's a simple case of ripping these down. When I actually milled the timber, you'll notice this edge here is still rough, but what I did, I milled this. So I've ended up with 3 square timber. So I've got 2 faces, and that edge there, that are actually square. So these 2 faces are parallel, and this face here is square to those 2 faces. So I can now use this as a reference face. So I can simply put my reference face against the fence on my saw and rip all these down to 32mm. Now due to a bit more weight than I expected, I've actually come out narrower than I wanted. And we wanted 270, which will be about there. And then this would leave me here 200. So I just need to check to see whether that's good enough or not. Now because I've never used this black frame before, I don't actually know how wide this bottom shelf needs to be. So there's a chance it's okay. So let's just check something. I just want to check where this inner post would come to. Which is about there. So my inner frame actually only wants to be round about 120, and we've got 200. So we make the top piece 285, trimmed down to the 275 we needed, and the bottom leg is going to be about 175, trimmed down to around about the 130 that we've needed. So we're in pretty good shape with these 2 pieces. So the next job is to laminate these up. Now I just want to check the material, because some of this oak I've used was quite gnarly and old. Nice texture, but gnarly and old. And I also want to start to look at some of the top patterns here. Like I've got medulla rays on this one that's quite attractive. So I just want to go through each piece and work out what the best top is. And this is purely subjective, of course. And I'm trying to avoid any knots and flaws that's going to be on the top, but try and get an attractive grain pattern as well. Like you can see here, I love these medulla rays on this one. On this side, this is quite boring, and I've got a knackered knot there, so that can go underneath. Quite like that swirl. Some nice medullas on this one and a knot there, so that can go on the top. I'm just going to take a piece of chalk. Now I've got them where I sort of kind of want them, and I'm just going to mark them with Carpenter's V, and that just shows me the orientation that I need to bring those together in. So we'll get this one glued up, I think. Usual glue up technique. As always, I'm using Titebond 3. Two reasons. It gives me a longer opening time, which allows me to mess about and try and get perfection during the glue up. But it's also a waterproof glue. So people, God forbid, do mistreat the thing I make for them and they wash it down. The glue's less likely to react to that. It's not a big risk, but it's just one of those things that keeps me happy. Before I do any gluing, I want to do a bit of a dry clamp on this one, because I just want to check I've got no gaps. So I've got 4 Bessie clamps here. These are obviously the parallel clamps from Bessie. The reason I like parallel clamps is they tend to give me a uniform pressure through the wood. So these faces on the clamps always stay parallel with each other as you do the overall glue up. I also want to make sure that this end here, there's no reason why it's this end, but either end will do. I want to make sure that my edge here is as flush as I can make it, and I'm just going to come in and put a little bit of clamping pressure on there. Now the reason I wanted that end flush is because I'm looking for an overall length of 1.2 meters on this piece of stock, and I'm pretty close to the wire. This piece here has sprung up, but once I've got a bit of clamping pressure on it, I can just knock that back down again, and the friction of the wood will just keep that where it needs to be. So I just want to make sure that these are as flush as I can make them. Don't just rely on the bars on the clamps, because the wood will spring here and there. You just want to make sure that you've got that as flush as you can. And it's the same technique you're going to use as you actually do the glue up as well. So have your parabatic hammer ready. Now these are all pretty much the same width, so you don't have to go mad on this one. But the smoother you can make this, the easier it is to sand, and more importantly, the less width we've got to take out the top when we're finished. Right, now I've done that, I'm going to come in with some realistic clamping pressure. That's gone a bit high there. And I want to examine it. And I'm looking for any gaps in the wood. Anything at all I'm not happy with. Now once I actually do the glue up, there's also a clamp here, and a clamp here, just to give me even tension through the wood, so we don't get any distortion or things bowing out, God forbid. But the thing about these parallel clamps, I say, because the face is clamped parallel, you have less of an issue of this distorting with clamping pressure. But it's always good practice to put some contrasting force onto your glue up. And I'm pretty happy with that, so I think I'm ready. So as well as the glue and the hammer, I also have a damp but not wet cloth. I'm tipping these away from me. Like so. So when I put glue on, I'll glue one face and I'll tip that back there. I can then glue the next face, and then I've got a dry face and a glued face coming together, which is what we want. Otherwise you get confused. And you can still see the remnants of the triangle that you put in place there, which shows you that you've got this in the right orientation. And you're looking for a nice even coverage here, and this goes slightly translucent, so you can just start to see the wood through here. It's what you're looking for. Tip it away from me, tip it away from me, and then I just want to make sure that those ends are lined up, and then I can do the next two. Sorry, I meant tip it towards me, I got giddy then. Okay. Again, I'm not doing stupid clamping pressure at this point, because we know we want to level this top out. Just wiping off those drips. And I can't stress enough, this is a damp cloth. If you have a wet cloth at this point, the water will run down into those joints, and that will weaken your glue joint for you. Right, cool. And now you'll find this a little bit harder than when it was dry, because that glue, even though it's a long opening, does start to just catch the wood, known as glue freeze. Don't be scared of it, give it some welly, and you're just trying to get this as flat as you can. We will be sanding it, so don't get too worried if you're not perfect. Get it as perfect as you can. Eventually get to the point where you're banging the wood and nothing actually is happening because the glue is beginning to go. Good. And then once you get to a point you're happy with, just nip up that clamping pressure a little bit. And what you're now looking at are these small beads of glue. And when they start to squeeze out in this way, you're where you need to be. See if we can just get that one now. Good. Now if you're not using parallel clamps at this point, if you're using sash clamps or something like that, you want to put something on here to counteract your clamping. If you can afford parallel clamps in this way, they make a world of difference on glue ups, they really do. It was game changing when I first used these. These are the Bessie clamps, so not cheap, great investment, but there are other ones on the marketplace. I did a review of some Souter clamps, which are pretty much generic clamps that you'll see. A lot of manufacturers make these now, one of the different brand names. So I'll leave a link to those Souter clamps up in the video, and then you can have a look at them. Top tip, always make sure that your clamping handles are on the same side, so in this case all facing me, because that allows me to stand up the top on these areas here, which allows me to really clamp down, as well as beginning to clean out the other side before the glue goes off. And then you can stand it up, and then you can get access to the other side and just clean off that gorgeous squeeze out. So they're both out the clamps now, looking really quite good, what you'd expect at this stage. Lots of burn marks, a few saw marks, but relatively flat, and the laminations are really nice. So the final job for now on these tops is I just want to sand them down, and for that we're going to use the drum sander. Start off with coarse grit and I'll gradually work down. I'll get the sander set up and we'll do that. So dropped an 80 grit paper into our belt sander. I'm going to take both the low shelf and the top shelf through that until I get it smooth enough. And then once I've got that flat, I'll work through the grits. I'll go to a 120, a 150, finish off with a 180. And we'll try and maintain as much thickness as we can, but it's more important that we have this thing nice and flat. So I'll crack on and get that done, and then we'll come back together. So these are now down to flatness. In the end I ended up taking about 6mm off the overall thickness of these to get them flat, but flat they are. Now these are actually brought down to 120. I did start to play around with the 180 grit paper. I'm not sure you can see that black mark there. That's a scorched mark. Obviously that's going through the machine. Very, very fine paper. Probably asking a little bit too much of it and it scorched it. So I stopped at 120, and I still need to finish these off by hand anyway, so I'm not overly concerned by that. One tip when you're doing this, what you do to one side, do to the other side. So even though this is the side that won't be seen, I've still brought this down to the same grit that I brought this side down. Now it's very tempting, get it flat with the 80 grit, leave it alone and just work on the top. What tends to happen if you do that, and it's only a small thing but worth knowing about, it alters how much the oil penetrates into the wood. If you have a lower grit, you'll get more penetration because you've got a rougher area to work on. If you have a very, very finely polished level, it repels the oil a little bit more and it just doesn't soak into the wood. as much. Now, why do you care? Well, the reason you care, it's all about that stability of the wood. The wood's going to continue to expand and contract and move around as moisture change is in the hole, or whatever this thing ends up, and you want it to be able to breathe equally on both sides of the wood. If you don't, it can once again put some slight bowing in the material. Now with these sort of laminations, it doesn't really matter because this is quite a stable design anyway now, but it's always good practice, and I like to put good practice into my projects as I can, because it all adds to stability over time. Next job is I want to bring these down to length. Now we know they're going to be 1.2 meters. I've just looked at these edges here and I like this edge, so I'm going to use this as a reference edge, and similarly this edge is quite nice, so I'll use this as a reference edge as well. So I'll trim one end off, make it nice and square to the reference edge, and then using the same reference edge I'll just come in and then bring it down to the 1.2 meter length. Variety of ways I could do this. Cross-cut sled would be good if you have the capacity on your table saw. You could use some sort of cross-cut sled on a bandsaw as well. We could always use the track saw. However, because this isn't very wide, I've got the capacity on my Capex, and the blade in my Capex is relatively new. It's much better than the one on my track saw that does need replacing. So to avoid scorching on the wood, I'm going to come in with the Capex to do this job. Now these are both obviously the same length, because why wouldn't they be? And the width on this one is about 175. And I don't know what width I want this one. We will worry about that once I've got the frame built, and then we can look at a bit of proportional dimensioning to bring that down to its final tolerance. Now I think I want to bring this down to its final size, and we said the final size wants to be about 275, and we're on about 283 and about 283. Again, there's a number of ways we could do this. I could use the table saw and I could rip this down to its final size. If I do that, it's going to give me a machined edge that's still going to need cleaning up. I could use the bandsaw, which will give me a nice cut, but same problem, it'll still need cleaning up. And we already know that the blade on my track saw is not that good at the moment. I need new blades, so I don't particularly want to scorch the wood. One thing we often overlook is I could plane this down, and I'm going to do just that. So I'll go to the planer jointer, I'll take those 4mm off on either side. You've seen me use a planer jointer before in this episode, so we don't need to go over that, I don't think. So I'll get that done, and when we come back together, we'll start to work on that frame, and I have no idea at all how that frame is going to work out. I've never used that material in my life, so we've got some things to think about. With that said, I'll get this done, we'll come back together, and I'll see you on the next episode where we'll get this table completed. See you soon.